Whether you're on Team Intel or Team AMD, it doesn't really matter. The fact that they both exist mean they're both going to be driving each other to do more stuff for us, the gamers. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and today we're going to be building a budget gaming PC using some Intel parts. So you can see here I've got this Intel ARC A750. I bought this used off of Facebook Marketplace, and I've been dying to get it into a machine and test it out, see what it can do. Bang for the buck wise, I think that this thing is supposed to be pretty spectacular. I know it's not as sexy as maybe an NVIDIA, but we're going to see if we can get a lot of power out of it for what I paid, and it was much less than what the competitors are charging for equivalent power. Now at the same time, I got an awesome deal on this Intel 1TB NVMe drive on Amazon. It was on super low price, and I figured let's go ahead and get an Intel chip, do an Intel deal, and get everything together. Now obviously I don't have an Intel case and I don't have Intel RAM, but this is about as close as you can get to an all Intel system. So let's take a look at some of the pieces I've got here. Like I said, this is a 1TB NVMe drive. This is the GPU, the A750. Really interested in seeing what this thing can do. And then for the CPU, we're going budget on this. So this is an i5 9400F. Not the latest and greatest, but still an awesome amount of power for a low price. I got some of these parts used, so this and the motherboard I got used, and I got it so cheap because someone had just upgraded. And if you ever want to build a cheap gaming PC, you're on a tight budget, look for that. Look for someone that just upgraded, find out what they upgraded, what parts they have, look at what they've listed for sale, see if it's a good deal, and then if it's a good deal, ask them, hey, do you have any other parts for sale? Because sometimes they have some other stuff that they don't think would sell, or they don't want to spend the time selling something, and they say, oh, I've got this case or I've got this power supply, and see what they got and see what they want for it. A lot of times if you're already meeting up with them, they're going to give you a good deal just because they want to get rid of it. So that's kind of what happened here. I got the motherboard, CPU, I got some RAM, I got a power supply, and it was pretty darn cheap. I built a lot of computers with this 9400F, and like I said, 6 cores, it's just a powerhouse for the price. So we got that. We're going to combine that up with the motherboard. This is the motherboard that I got from the same guy. It's an ASRock B360M IB-R1. Now what does that mean? That means that this was in an iBuy power. That's what the IB stands for. ASRock, you can actually see if you look closely, it's a sticker on top of whatever this B360M board may have been. And I've talked about this before on the channel, where this is a good way to save some money. If you look at how they saved money, right, they being iBuyPower, they keep some parts off. Like here's some more of the I/O header that should have been on here that's taken off. So they save some money on the parts in the manufacturing process. ASRock gives them a good deal. They give us a good deal on their pre-built systems. And later down the road, when someone sells their pre-built system or upgrades that pre-built system, it saves me some money. So I like that. So again, not the best chipset in the world, but again, we're building this on a budget. This is going to match and pair perfectly with that 9400F, and we're going to see if we can push this thing with that A750 GPU. So it gives us 4 RAM slots. Obviously it's an Intel chipset. We've got enough I/O header here to do most tasks. You know, I don't know if it's missing maybe DVI. We don't really need a DVI header because we're not going to use that anyways. We're going to be using a dedicated GPU. It's got a Wi-Fi card here, which hopefully works. I've got the I/O plate that has the antenna leads for that, so we'll see if we can get that working. But other than that, should be a nice little micro ATX board to populate with some parts. And to finish it out, we've got some RAM. I've got this Trident Z RGB, and I've been kind of holding this for an Intel system because it's 3000 megahertz. So 3000 megahertz is going to be plenty fine for this 9400F. I didn't want to use this with like a AMD chipset that wants that 3600 speed. So this will pair nicely, give it a little RGB bling, and I may have an RGB fan that I'll put on there just to give it a little bit of bling inside the case. As far as the case goes, it's sitting over there on the floor right now. I've got a thermal take. I think it's an H18 tempered glass, so we'll get that when we need to. So the first thing I always do is populate the board, get it hooked up to a PSU, get it all going to a monitor and make sure everything's working in the BIOS, install Windows, get all the drivers loaded up, and then I take the whole thing, just slap it in the case, do some cable management, and play some games. So let's get this thing ready to go. Alright, so let's get this board populated. If you've watched my videos before, you know I like to kind of talk things through just to help people learn as they go. So if this is the first time you've built something, hopefully I give you enough tips along the way to make you successful. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this RAM in, and on this particular board, the banks that are matched are the ones closest to the CPU. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's the second one that you want to use. So make sure you do reference your book. ASRock is pretty good about having PDFs for all their manuals right on their website. So that's where you can go to find that. So I'm going to pop this RAM in here. And on this particular board, only one side of the clip's open. So these clips are stationary, and these clips open and shut. So they're going to lock down once I push this in here. So I've opened those all up for this to start. And I'm just going to kind of line up both edges, looking at the offset notch here to make sure it matches the offset notch here. And slide it in there like that. And I'm going to push on the stationary side, and then I'm going to push on the locking side, like one right after another. So you should get a click click when you do that. Take the second chip. It's going to be over in the third slot on this one. And we're going to do the same thing. Line it up, make sure the offset's set. Kind of get it. I like to get it in there flat first to make sure that it's not crooked when I'm about to push it. And once I know that it's kind of level, then I can do the snap snap. And then I always like to take a finger and rub it over both of them together to make sure that they're both kind of seated parallel like that, and not, you know, one like this. That would tell you that one side is not locked in. So I'm happy with that. And the reason I did that first is so I could test to see if my cooler is going to fit. Now I did want to put this Thermaltake RGB cooler on here, but the problem is I've used a lot of these. The fan on this thing is kind of big, and it would not fit on the CPU. The side of this is going to be hitting this RAM here. If these RAM banks were shifted over a little bit, then this would work. But I did check, and the RAM will not work in those other banks by themselves. So much for that RGB. We're going to go ahead and grab, this is a CPU cooler that actually came with it. It is a little dusty, but I cleaned it up the best I could. Nothing that's going to impede the flow of air at all. So this is going to be the one that I use. Nothing fancy, but it's going to get the job done. So now that I got the RAM in there, let's go ahead and get the CPU cage open. And at this point, you want to make sure you don't touch anything or get anything inside those pins. Of course, if this was brand new, it would have a protective plastic plate over it. But it actually had the CPU in there, so that's just about as good as having the protective plate. And I took the CPU out just for demonstration purposes. So let's grab this CPU here. And when we lay it in there, it's okay to touch the sides, but you want to keep your fingers off the gold contacts as much as you can. So I'm going to look to see where my notches are. So you can see a couple notches on the side of the CPU here, and you can line those up with the notches that are in the socket here. The other thing you can do is look for, on one of the corners should be a gold triangle. So in this corner it has a gold triangle, and then on your board itself there should be a gold triangle that matches that. So if that all matches up, then we should be able to slide this right in here and lay it down flat. And once you lay it down in there flat, I always kind of take my finger and wiggle it, grab it and wiggle it a little bit, just to make sure that I did get the notches right and it is sitting in there flat. Once I know that's sitting in there flat, you can close the cage down. So you want to get this lip underneath this little post here, and then when you start bringing this arm down, it's going to be kind of spring tensioned. It's going to feel like you're about to break something, but you're not. Just go ahead and push it straight down, and then you're going to move the arm around the little locking mechanism, and then that's it. So now that CPU is in place, we got our RAM, we got our CPU, we're ready to put our cooler down on there. So before you mount your cooler, if you got a brand new cooler that's got, like this one would have had some thermal paste applied on it to begin with, this one is completely cleaned off. So we need to get some thermal compound in there. I usually just use this Thermaltake TG7 stuff. And we're just going to squirt just a little pea-sized bead here in the middle. There's a lot of different camps about what's the best way to do it, but I've never had a problem doing it this way. So once we get that on there, now because this one is a 4-screw mechanism, we do have a back plate on here, and on the back plate it has some little threaded inserts in the 4 holes. That's a little bit different than if you had a stock cooler, like this is an Intel stock cooler that would have come with that i5 processor, where it doesn't use any threaded inserts. You just kind of poke these things down into those holes and the ears grab on them. Those are okay, but sometimes they're just a pain in the butt. I kind of like being able to screw something down and know that it's going to stay secured and not pop out at some point. So I always make sure that the fan lead is going to match the header. So you look on the board for the one that says CPU fan. You'll have several different fan headers on here. Find the one that says CPU. Make sure that whatever orientation you mount this thing down at, that the cable here is going to reach. So now you're going to lay this thing down flat on here, because once you push this down, it's going to start smearing that thermal grease, and you don't want to kind of reposition it a whole lot because that's going to smear that grease all over the place. So you try to get it down in the right spot the first time. I'm going to hold that down a little bit while I grab my screwdriver, and I'm going to try to get the first one of these screws at least started, a couple threads started, and then I move over to the opposite end diagonally and see if I can get a couple threads started. Once I get those threads started and I know that it's kind of secured, then I can just work my way around the rest of them. And sometimes you have to kind of reline those things up a couple times because the screws don't want to go straight down into those threaded sockets. But once you get a couple threads in there and it feels secure, then the more threads that you get, you can start feeling it get a little bit tighter and tighter, and that's telling you that it is working its way down. So let me go ahead and finish this off. Alright, now in this type of CPU cooler, once you thread those things down, they should be spaced perfectly so that when the screw stops turning, that's at the correct height. So don't try to over tighten it at all, just get it to where it's tight and not loose, and then you can always do the little pick up and wiggle test, and this one definitely passed that. So once you get that done, don't forget to plug in your fan header, and if you look at the fan header itself, you've got 4 pins on here, and you've got a plastic spacer here. That plastic spacer is going to fit right in between these 2 plastic notches. So once you get that lined up, it's going to slip right on without any kind of pressing. You can flip this thing around and put it in the wrong way, but that would not be good. They put that spacer on there for a reason, to help you line that up. Alright, now we're ready to put the hard drive on. And you can see here on the board, there should be 2 NVMe slots, one right here and one right here. And you can see that indicative of these little mounting holes. But looks like they saved a little bit of money by not even soldering on the connector for this one. So that's another way that these pre-built companies save some money, cheating us out of a second hard drive connector. But we've got 1 terabyte. That should be plenty of room for this computer. So we're going to go ahead and plug it in here. Now you can see we got different slots right here for this mounting stud. For this particular one, it should be 80 millimeters. So it looks like it's already lined up perfectly. So we're going to take this drive out, and you can see that it's got an offset notch here on the connector, and you want to match that up with the offset notch on the socket down here. And we're going to lay this in at a slight angle, and I kind of wiggle it back and forth a little bit, up and down, to make sure that all those contacts seat all the way in there. And one way you can look, if you look really close right here, you don't want to see something like this where you can see some of the gold of the contacts laying out. Now obviously it wouldn't mount like that, but that's an exaggeration. But we want to get this all the way down, and if we set this down, you'll see that this little notch here, this little mounting notch, is going to line right up with that mounting stud. So at this point, if it came with a screw, good. If not, hopefully there's a screw that came with the motherboard. Motherboards, brand new motherboards, obviously come with screws for them. If not, then you can buy these things on Amazon. Now, if you've ever put one of these on, you know how small they are. They're tiny. So you want to make sure you get the right size screwdriver. And in this case, I've got a Phillips 1, which is going to work. A Phillips 0 would probably work also. You don't want to go too small, you don't want to go too big. And my recommendation is always use a magnetized screwdriver. If you've watched my videos before, you know I'm always talking about this Strabito kit, 20-something bucks on Amazon. I use it for all my laptops and MacBook repairs and stuff. And anytime I'm using an M.2 or an NVMe screw, I always use this because otherwise it's just a pain in the butt to try to keep this thing on here. So we're just going to make sure that's still seated in there, press that down, and with the magnetic tool it goes in just like that. If you try to use something like this that's non-magnetic, maybe not the right size, something cheap that you can get at Walmart, then you're going to spend way too much time and effort trying to get that on there. So now our hard drive's on there, we've got our RAM, our CPU cooler. At this point, it's probably a good time to go ahead and hook up a power supply, boot it up into BIOS, make sure BIOS sees our CPU correctly, our RAM correctly, and recognizes that there's a drive plugged in. Alright, so let's get this PSU hooked up. What I've got here is a PowerSpec 650 watt bronze rated, 80 plus bronze rated PSU. The Intel A750 said it needed like a 500 to 550 watt PSU, so this will be plenty good for that. And you do want to make sure you look at something like the 12 volt rail to make sure that it is getting enough power. In this case, it's showing 585 watts. Sometimes on some of the lesser known brands, they'll pump more power into some of the smaller rails and then leave you kind of wanting more on the 12 volt. In this case, I'm pretty happy with that. We got enough connections on this. This is a semi-modular, which means the motherboard connections here are going to be kind of pre-wired, and then you plug in whichever additional ones that you may need for your GPU and your hard drives and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get some of these connectors plugged in, starting with the big motherboard connector here. That's going to go on the far right here. You want to make sure that you wiggle it down in there and snap it and make sure that it's seated well all the way around, because sometimes one side will stick up a little bit, so you want to kind of look around and make sure that it's seated on there perfectly. And then the next one's going to be the CPU. In this case, it's an 8-pin. So we're going to plug those over here. And with this one, you want to make sure that this isn't kind of resting on that fan, so we'll kind of push it to the side. No other real moving parts on here, just the fan, so it can touch some of the other things without any problems. So that's going to give us enough power to power this thing up. Now to power it up, since it's not inside a case, there's usually a push button on the case that you use to push it, to turn it on. If you know which pins you're looking at, you can use just a screwdriver and short those out. I do that probably half of the time, and the other half of the time I do the right thing and use something like this, which is just a little front panel simulator. And this, in this case here, this yellow and orange pair, I know is going to be the power button. So I put that on the power lead header here. And again, you can see the description of what these pins are silk screened on the board, but it's really tiny. So I usually just use the PDF and look at the manual and find out which header it is, which pins it is on that header. So what that gives me is it gives me a nice easy button here to push, to simulate pushing the power button on the front of the PC. That's really the safest way to do it if you're not used to shorting out pins with a screwdriver, because you may short out pins that you're not supposed to. So now we've got the power hooked up. We'll hook up some power to this power supply. Let's get some USB and video coming out of here, and then we can check out the BIOS. Alright, so I got my USB cable plugged in here. That's going towards my mouse and keyboard. And for video, since this is a 9400F, that means it has no video integrated into the chip. So we have to use a little cheap video card, and I use this one for most of my builds anyways, just to mock it up to get it tested. And then once I get it in the case, then I put in the real one. So when you plug this thing in, it's got this extra bracket length here to mount into your case, and that's not going to be good because it's going to be pushing down into the bench, and it's going to want to wiggle this thing up. So here's another little tip. I buy these Rubbermaid little fake Tupperware things from Walmart real cheap, and I use them as spacers. Just put them underneath the static bag, kind of get this motherboard just off the table. And I usually don't do that until I mount everything else, because you don't want to be pushing down on this when it's wobbly when you're seating your RAM. So now that it's all ready to go, now I can plug this thing in here. And now it's not pushing down. I still got a finger's worth of gap under here where it's not pushing down on the table. So I got my video going off to my monitor, and I'm ready to fire this thing up. So let's go ahead and boot this up and see what we see in BIOS. Alright, so I'm going to power up the power supply, turn on the power switch to that. Got my magic button here, so I'm going to push that. First thing I want to see is the fan spinning on the PSU itself, and then of course the fan spinning on the CPU cooler. That's obviously good. Got some lights on the RGB. Now, depending on your motherboard, sometimes it'll boot right up into BIOS if it doesn't find anything on the hard drive. In this case, it wants us to reboot and hit F2 to get into the BIOS. So I'm going to reboot, start smacking that F2 key. And there we go. So let's look at the BIOS here and see what we can find. It sees the i5-9400F CPU at 2.9 gigahertz, 16 gigs of memory. It sees both of these G.Skill 8 gigabytes running at 2133, and we can adjust that with some XMP settings to get those up to the 3000. But I always boot with whatever it boots to first with the defaults. Get Windows completely installed and all the drivers updated, and then I go back into BIOS and play around with these overclocking the RAM if I want to. And it does see on this M.2 slot the Intel SSD, so that's good. So that means that that slot that I plugged it into was the right type for that particular type of hard drive, which is good. It recognizes it. So everything in BIOS looks good. We got the CPU fan showing up here, and this is all in the easy mode. We can go to advanced mode and see a little bit more if we want to. But I'm happy at this point with this. So I think the next thing we're going to do is plug in a Windows install disk and get Windows loaded up onto that hard drive. Alright, so we got it all up and running with Windows 10, and on these older systems I usually like to install Windows 10 first, get it all working, make sure everything's good, and then check the compatibility with Windows 11. So this is a good starting point at least. Got all the drivers loaded up. Let's take a look at the hardware. There's the i5-9400F. Here's our 16 gigs memory. There's our 1 terabyte Intel SSD, and we're just rocking this little GeForce GT 710 until we can get this into a case and get that new Intel ARC A750 in there. So I guess the next step is let's go ahead and take this board, unplug a couple things, get this mounted into a case so we can finish this up. So here's our first look at the case here, and like I said, it's just a Thermaltake H18. Very simple case, but it's got everything that we're going to need, and I've used these a lot. And they're easy to work in. They look good when they're done. It's nothing overly flashy, but it's just a good all-around case. So let's start getting some bits and pieces mounted up into this thing. So here's another use I have for these little Rubbermaid little food containers that I use just to keep all the screws in here. So these are the screws that came with the case. You got all these extra ones here for the 2.5-inch drive and the 3.5-inch drive. Probably not going to need any of those. So basically just the motherboard screws, and it just gives us a little place to keep these handy. As far as the connections we got the standard connections in here for all the front panel stuff. And then the only thing that's special is we do have a Molex labeled LED, so there is like an LED strip on the front here that just glows. It's not going to be RGB or anything, but just a little accent light. So we can hook this up if we want to. So let's go ahead and get the motherboard mounted in here, and we can start connecting some of these cables. Alright, so I verified that all these motherboard risers were in the right place, so I'm good to go with that. And because I did have to connect this I/O shield to the Wi-Fi card to get those updates done earlier, I do have to kind of set this in here without it getting scratched up, get this mounted, and then I can go ahead and flush this up to the front and take that static bag out from underneath. So let's get these Wi-Fi antennas off of here and get this I/O shield installed. And when you install that I/O shield, you want to make sure that it is mounted flush all the way and snapped all the way in, or else the motherboard just won't line up right. And we got this little fan header here. I just had to keep tucked out of the way from the fan that's in the back here. So I think we're ready to go ahead and get this motherboard flushed up to where it needs to be before we can start mounting it down. Alright, so I did knock off one of these little antenna cables. They're so tiny. In the process of mounting that in there, it got caught behind the fan wire. But I'll go ahead and replace that just in a minute. It looks like all my mounting holes are lined up. So let's go ahead and get some of these screws sent down. Alright, all those screws are in there, and now's a good time to go ahead and just plug in this fan. We got a fan header right here next to it. That's always nice to see. And the same thing with this one. There should be a little plastic spacer that's going to fit right in between the grooves on your fan. Alright, and when we get all done, I may tie wrap that up to make it a little bit prettier, but it's sitting pretty nice right now. So I think we're going to go ahead and grab that power supply, get that mounted in here, and get those power supply cables plugged in first. Alright, so the power supply just slides right in from the back side here, and we got 4 mounting holes, and I am mounting it with the fan facing down since there is a vented cover down underneath there, so we'll be good with that. And the power supply usually comes with its own screws, but the motherboard or the case usually comes with enough of these also. So this style screw right here is what we're going to use to mount this. So I usually get these power supply screws just started a couple threads each just to make sure that everything's going to line up, because sometimes there's optional mounting holes and it just depends on what kind of cutout you have on your case. Then once you're sure that all 4 are going to line up right, then you can go ahead and tighten them all the way down. Alright, and this case has a nice little cutout right up top here for the ATX cable. So we'll go ahead and take that one and send it up that way. And then you have a couple options here for the big power supply cable. I usually see where that connector is, which one's going to be the best, and it looks like this one's going to be the best. So we'll send it through there. We'll turn it around and plug those in, and then we can start kind of wire tying these things down to keep them in place. When you plug in these big power supply cables, you want to make sure that you do get them seated all the way down onto the socket. And on this one, it's usually pretty easy as long as you can get your hand into it. With this one, depending on how you mounted, how many screw holes you mounted to the back of your motherboard, if there's no support on the far side here, then you don't want to just grab this thing and push it straight down, because you can actually bend the board. So I usually just kind of get my fingers behind it to give it some stability, and then just use my thumb to make sure that this thing is pushed all the way down in there. So we got those taken care of. Let's go ahead and look at some of those other cables and bring them up for the front I/O. Alright, so I usually start off with the thicker cables like this USB 3 here, and then we get the HD audio down here, and the USB 2 cable. So I got those all plugged into their respective ports, and we'll go ahead and push the slack through and tidy that up in the back. Then I've got all the little skinny ones here that go to the front I/O. That's the power switch, the reset switch, and the HDD LED. On this case, we don't have a power LED because basically when you plug in that light bar, that light strip on the front, that's just going to basically serve as your power light. When that's on, you know the computer's on. And we've got the PCI power cable down here, just waiting for that big GPU to plug in here so we can figure out where the best place to put that is. So I think I got everything kind of plugged in. I think the next step is, let's go ahead and plug in that GPU, get it powered up, and then we can do a test boot to make sure everything works still, and then we can tidy up the cables. Alright, and here it is. This is the Intel ARC A750, and this is a good looking card here. I mean, nothing flashy, no bling or RGB or anything, but it's just a mean looking card. Just all one color, and I can't wait to see this thing in action. So we do have plenty of power going into it. That's why it needed that 550 watt PSU. So let's go ahead and get this plugged in, get it wired up, and let's boot this thing up. Alright, I think I got everything plugged up here. I'll probably replace these red tie wraps here with some black ones just to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. But let's go ahead and push the power button here. And there we go. Looks like everything's firing up. And there we have Windows. And it took a little extra time than normal to come up with the screen, but I think that's just because Windows was learning that there's new GPU in there. So let's see if Windows even recognizes it yet. And no, it doesn't see the GPU yet. So let's check Device Manager. And under display adapters, it's just seeing the basic display adapter so far. So let's try to find a driver for this online and see if that works. Alright, so it downloaded the drivers and then rebooted. Let's go ahead and see if it sees now. Yep, Windows now sees this Intel ARC A750 graphics card. So the driver was all it needed. So that's good to go. So I think the next thing we should do is maybe run a benchmark or two and see if we can get a game running on this thing and test it out. Alright, so just after a little bit of testing and a little bit of research, turns out that this A750 may not be the right card for this system, or more importantly, this system is not the right system for this card. So I guess to get the full power out of this thing, you need to have something enabled in your BIOS called resizable bar, and that is not available on the BIOS on this chipset. So this older chipset, this 9th gen Intel, does not have that option, and after running a couple benchmarks, it looks like it's not performing up to its potential. So I think I may have to change gears here, take this out, save it for maybe a higher end Intel system, and we can revisit that at that point. So I do have a couple of GPUs around here, and since I've got a fairly decent power supply in there, I may try to use this card and see how it works. This is one I've been holding on to for a while, just waiting for the right system. This is a GTX 980 Ti, an absolute powerhouse for its day, but obviously very dated now, and very, very power hungry. So we'll see, maybe throw this in here, see how it works, and it will be more budget minded anyways, because I'm not going to be putting this in a high-end machine these days. So I might as well let somebody that's looking for a budget system take advantage of a decent card still today, just not obviously the newest card. So let's go ahead and pop this out, pop this in, and see if we can get a little better results in some benchmarks. Alright, so the good news is these red tie wraps actually match the new card, so that's a thumbs up. And I got this installed in here and got the drivers downloaded for it and got it all up and running. Now I'm running a benchmark here. This is just an older benchmark called Heaven, and it is running pretty darn smooth. It's getting up around 79 degrees Celsius and the fans are spinning, so that's about normal for a card this big. I mean, this is a big honking card, and it has got a lot of power going into it. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But this thing still does have some life left in it, and it's going to play modern games, probably medium pretty easily, maybe even some high settings. But I think we can get a lot of life left out of the system here. So I'm going to go ahead and let this benchmark finish out and see how it goes. I think it's running great. I think we are done with this thing. As much as I would love to have gotten the full power out of this thing today, we're just going to have to stick it on the shelf for another day. So stay tuned, hit that subscribe button. I'll find a good home for that thing. Don't you worry about it. So let me go ahead and let this benchmark finish out, and then I'm going to tidy up some of the cables in the back, and we'll be ready for the final product. Alright, so I got all the cables tidied up in the back. Not the prettiest thing in the world, but they're all out of the way and they're all tidied up well. So I got that taken care of. One other thing I did do is add a fan up front here, since the case didn't come with it, but I had another black fan to kind of stick with that same color scheme. And it's facing in. It's going to blow some fresh air straight over this card here and blow it straight out the back, so that'll keep it a little bit cooler. And everything else up front is tidied up. I'm going to get the front glass on here, and didn't want to put that on yet because it causes such a glare that you won't be able to see anything. But this is our finished product. I really wish I could have used this Intel ARC A750 in here, but just wasn't meant to be. That's my mistake for not doing a little research up front. That's why you always want to research these things before you start putting them together, but I thought I knew what I was doing. In this case, something brand new like that I just didn't know. So besides boxing it up and getting it all finished off with the last door here, I guess the last step will be to find it a new owner. So I'll probably post this thing on Marketplace or Craigslist and see if I can find a new owner for it, someone that will enjoy playing some games on it. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you have any questions about anything that I did or how I put it together, just go ahead and drop them down in the comments below and I'll be happy to answer them. I've got plenty of other videos on the channel of building computers, so go ahead and check those out. You can learn little tidbits from each one of them. And needless to say, I still got tons of parts left, so I'm going to be building a couple more computers, so stay tuned for that. And thank you as always for watching. If you enjoyed this and got anything out of it, then give me a thumbs up. I appreciate that. If you want to see more, smash that subscribe button. And until next time, peace out and geek out.